Thank you so much, Ulrik, for the presentation. I need to correct the height of the microphone. Yes, as Ulrik said, I have a background in exercise physiology, and as you can see, some of the affiliations I have is also going to inspire a little bit the direction of my talk here today. And of course, the reason why this is on the agenda, I think, is also that we know that functional impairments has a profound impact on multiple aspects of life, and especially quality of life in persons with MS. So that is why we also have a main focus to see how functional recovery can actually be achieved. And I'm going to focus a little bit about some of the non-pharma treatment strategies: exercise, rehab, cognitive rehabilitation, and healthy lifestyle. And I'll try a little bit to summarize what the current level of evidence is, but also what the current limitations are, to help guide perhaps where we can go in the future. Starting out with the exercise, we know that if you do, commonly you have three main modalities of exercise you operate with: resistance training, balance training, and cardiovascular aerobic training. And we know that if you do resistance training, you get stronger. If you do a balance training, you get a better balance. If you do aerobic training, you get a better aerobic capacity of VO2 max. And that's been shown now in numerous studies in MS patients. And the evidence level in that sense is quite good. And as you can see, the effect sizes around 0.8, 0.9 is quite large. You can of course also just do a mix of these modalities, and then you get a little bit of everything in terms of adaptations. But the most important part is that these adaptations will eventually translate into improvements in this case, lower extremity physical function. And we know that mobility is improved. We know that walking capacity is improved, with some medium to large effect sizes shown in these different reviews. So in that sense, yes, exercise works in terms of functional recovery. But there are some limitations with the current studies. So we have very few long-term studies. I think there are two studies lasting, one study is lasting 1 year and one lasting 2 years, where the 2 years is a very small study. So we need more studies in that in terms of looking at the long-term perspective. And a few of the studies actually target persons with impairment. So they specifically screen and identify those that have, for instance, balance impairments, and then they do an intervention targeted for that. So the more personalized approach is needed. And dose response is actually surprisingly almost unknown. So we don't know what is the dose response in terms of intensity and duration to help do that. And this information could help guide how we plan and administer a personalized rehab as well, or exercise. And I think from a personal side, I think also there is a gap, there is an opportunity to link the brain CNS adaptations that can be achieved with exercise into some of the functional adaptations. So that, bench to bedside translation, as was also mentioned yesterday by Wei Young, is quite important. And I think there is a number of good opportunities to do that. And the final part here is that there is actually quite a little focus on patient diversity. So there are a few studies on older MS patients, and that's a little bit surprising considering that 1/3 of all MS patients are 60 years and above. A few studies on children pediatrics, a few studies on those actually having a high disability level, EDSS 6, 7, 8. And that's of course because it's quite complicated to do these studies, but it's extremely important to also have these type of studies being done. And I think race, ethnicity is also something that hasn't really been tapped into in this area. So that there is some ways to go forward in that sense. A little shift towards physical rehabilitation, which it may not be completely the same as exercise, but most often it's a combination of different exercise modalities that is being provided to a person in a mixed program. And luckily, yes, it also works. So based on physical therapy or multidisciplinary rehabilitation, there is actually quite strong evidence that lower extremity physical function can be improved. Again, mobility, walking capacity, and so on. And if we talk about upper limb rehabilitation, it also works. It also works for the upper extremities. So arm and hand function can actually also be partially improved. Hand dexterity, strength, and endurance. So again, as with exercise, physical rehabilitation works. But as for the rehab settings, I think some of the major limitations is that the exact content of what is being provided is rarely described in detail. So it's actually difficult for others to replicate or learn from some of the more effectful interventions and adapt that into the practice. So there's some sort of a black box of rehab. There's a little focus on patient diversity, just as same as with exercise, and the dose response is also unknown. So a little bit the same challenges as with traditional exercise. Then we have a little bit of a focus on the rehab. If we have the notion of time is brain as a focal point. Some years ago, 10 years ago, Asano and colleagues did this more topical or scoping review where they argued that rehabilitation should actually be integrated into managing a relapse. But very few studies have actually been investigating and examining that. And then in 2020, Scott Rooney and colleagues, they did this update where they just substituted rehab with exercise. And they have this illustration, as you can see here on the x-axis, you have the time and disability on the y-axis, and you just have the full line is just a normal natural course of an MS relapse. You have a relapse peak in the middle, and then over time you do recover, but you still have some residual disability. And they argued that if you initiate exercise at the time of the relapse or when the relapse occurred, you could have a milder course. So the relapse peak is smaller and the residual disability is reduced. And just 2 comments for that. I would say that rehab may work as well. If it's a relapse that more targets or affects the cognitive function, then it should probably be cognitive rehabilitation that is the mode of action to deal with that. And I would say that it doesn't necessarily have to be immediately, because many patients will most likely not be ready for that, because when they have a relapse, there's so much other things going on. But it's more as early as possible. But these type of studies has actually not been done. So there is a gap in terms of handling that, adding the rehabilitation part into managing a relapse. Okay, shifting a little bit towards cognitive function, there has also been some interest in exercise and how that can affect cognitive function in MS patients. It's mostly been based on aerobic training study, aerobic exercise studies. And well, the effects look modest at best. This review from 21, 13 studies were identified. What they observed was there was a trend towards an improvement in information processing speed, but not other cognitive domains or constructs. And then just earlier this year, this updated review came out. 8 additional studies were identified, and what they saw was a little bit contrasting. So now they saw that global cognition as well as memory and learning were improved, whereas processing speed did not. So it's a little bit difficult to understand what's what here. And one of the reasons is that most of these studies are underpowered. And few studies actually are designed, if any of the studies are designed towards the cognitive functional outcome. So it's a secondary outcome in most of the studies, and that's also one of the issues, I think. And again, few longer term studies and few studies targeting the impaired persons with MS. So those having cognitive impairments are not those that are enrolled in these studies. It's just a mix of patients, and you're trying to repair persons that you're trying to recover cognitive function in persons that have a normal cognitive function. So you're trying to fix something that's not broken. So there's a gap in terms of that. But of course, if you really want to go down to the essence in terms of recovering the cognitive function, then cognitive rehabilitation is likely the way to go. And there is actually some quite strong evidence that came out last year by Lawrence Taylor and colleagues from the UK, and they at least saw that memory rehabilitation was quite effective in terms of improving cognitive function in MS patients. And they observed some immediate medium to large effects on different measures of memory, but also information processing speed. What they also saw was that in those studies that reported it, that in a follow-up period afterwards, the effects slowly waned out. So 1 to 6 months after, the effect sizes declined a little bit, and then beyond 6 months, some of the effect sizes actually were almost gone. So it's a little bit the use it or lose it principle. And it aligns to me a little bit what was mentioned by John DeLuca and colleagues in their review paper, Nature Reviews, that it is a little bit, if you don't do the rehab, then the functions are maybe lost over time again. And with some great support by John DeLuca and Anthony Feinstein on these topics here, they also addressed and supported that in cognitive rehabilitation, what is limited so far is that the studies are underpowered. There are a few longer-term studies. The dose response is unknown, and there's little focus on certain cognitive constructs and domains. So the majority of the studies have focused on memory and learning and information processing speed, but aspects such as executive function has received little attention. And again, few studies actually target these impaired persons with MS. So it's some of the same, aspects that is seen with exercise and physical rehabilitation. Just a brief note on lifestyle. There are a number of studies based on cross-sectional studies, and of course that does not tell us anything about causality, but there are some studies that supports that physical activity, being physically active, especially if you do it with a moderate to vigorous intensity, is associated with a better physical function. As for cognitive function, the data does not look that promising in that sense, and just last year there came this study from Sandroff and colleagues on the CogX baseline data, showing that there were no association between physical activity and memory and information processing speed. So it seems to have an influence on physical function, but not cognitive function to that extent at least. There's also aspects about diet. If you adhere to a Mediterranean diet, there seems to be a good association with physical function, but also cognitive function. And the last part, which I think will receive much more attention in the coming years in terms of lifestyle, if we can call it that, is that sleep may also be associated with some of these, the physical function, the cognitive function. As for the existing data, there doesn't really seem to be a strong association between sleep and physical function in MS patients, but when you look at sleep and cognitive function, there seems to be quite good links in that sense. So these lifestyle factors may also be important to try to incorporate, and we're of course all aware of that, but we need much more in that direction. So the summary slide, which is going to be a little bit busy in a minute, this is an illustration from the review paper by John DeLuca and colleagues, and you have the x-axis time and then cognitive function on the y-axis, and you can see that the purple line that is a little bit exponential, it's a brain pathology, and then you have the dotted line in the middle, which is impairment. So that's a threshold of cognitive impairment. Then you have two causes. What the blue one is a patient is one patient's cognitive function without receiving any cognitive rehabilitation. So the person declines over time without receiving cognitive rehabilitation. The green one is an example of a patient, or illustration of a patient that crosses the impairment threshold and then is offered cognitive rehabilitation, and then he or she can regain some of the cognitive functions that has been lost. and over time that will likely be shown in a better course. So in theory, when we talk about what's on the y-axis here, it could just as well be physical function. It's the same principles. It could just as well be other functional aspects, bladder function. It's the same principles. And whatever is above the impairment threshold is reserve capacity, and that's extremely important to build and possess in terms of being more resilient towards disease progression. As for, if you look at the green bar here, the detailed description of rehab which was needed, well, we actually have a lot of good tools out there, the TIDIA, the CERT, to describe interventions and the content of interventions. So I think that should be promoted much more to help advance in that field. And of course, I would also say that we need to embrace the complexity in the rehab world, the exercise world. So by adding or involving a multidisciplinary approach, we need a practitioner, or we need health personnel across different fields, nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and so on, to help deal with this complex symptomology that MS patients faces. And I think the application of AI or decision algorithms to help guide rehab in the right direction for the individual patient is a way to go. As for the lack of long-term, probably powered studies. Well, the solution is collaboration, echoing what Alan Thompson has said a number of times. So the multi-center, multinational collaboration is the way to go. And I think the COGX study is a great example of that. And I would say that the translational approach could, in theory, easily be adapted into some of these projects. So having like assessment of brain or nervous system function or structure to add into the understanding of how the functional level adapts. Of course, the targeting of the impaired persons is important, but we also need to decide on how to perform the routine screening, timing of screening tools to use. And again, I think the application of AI or decision algorithms, big data, is a way to go here. And then I think we also need to be a little bit more clever in terms of combining some of the information. And it could be like a cognitive rehab added to diet or physical activity or sleep interventions. And then you will likely have a more optimal trajectory of your disease course. And it could also be, initiated early on. So the early, initiation of rehab exercise or lifestyle is also potentially highly beneficial. So it may not necessarily be about restoration, but more about preservation. So it's more about optimal preservation over time. The three last bullet points here is more some considerations for discussion is that are we overlooking some important bodily function? I mainly focused on physical function and cognitive function. What about bladder function? We actually have some pretty good treatment options out there, and we need to incorporate that much more into routine care, I think. Are we overlooking other functional recovery strategies? That's also important to notice. And I think the last point, which I think we will go more into in the coming years, hopefully, is to look at what is the combination or perhaps even synergistic effects of a non-pharma and a pharma interventions. So medication plus rehab or exercise or diet. That's a huge untapped area there. That was it. And I think my 15 minutes is over now after 17 minutes. So thank you for the attention.